Okay, well, it looks like some people are making it over to this part of the session. And I see one question has come in so far about describing the piston deployment scheme. And I'm not quite sure what that question means, but I'm basically it's just a normally functioning piston. Like I said, I'm sort of a big proponent of pistons for main chutes. I see a lot of flights, particularly larger airframes, where the the main doesn't come out because it's not set up so that the nose cone pulls the main out, and the piston sort of mitigates that, and the result of it is just more reliable. So I've always liked using them. I had one question about using the post-mortem analysis to kind of try to tell me what I did wrong on a flight and to learn for something else. And that's sort of an interesting question. I went through a period of time before I sort of figured out how to fly extreme rockets, and had some failures and had parts to look at. And I can't say it was always real easy to figure out exactly what went wrong, because the problem is that something happens, and then due to the speed, it basically tears everything else up. So I had a lot of flights where I just had to kind of try to guess what was the real root cause of the problem, and it was a little bit frustrating because I didn't really know what happened. At one point in time, I finally figured out that having sort of the fiberglass, they used to call them slinky fiberglass, was sort of a weak spot in the rockets, and that's one of the reasons why I just went with the bulkheads inside those couplers, just to kind of keep those from failing, because I'm pretty sure I had a problem with that at one point. So I have a question from Deborah about the ratio on using epoxy fillers, and I guess it really just varies. I don't have any particular recipes for how much filler I use. But really, the whole point of using them is that you can tailor the amount of additive that you're using for exactly the flow and the characteristics you want. I would say that's sort of a limitation of structural epoxies, but having not used many of them, maybe that would be overstating the case. But I just think that epoxies are strong enough pretty much regardless of what you do with them. And it's a lot more helpful to be able to tailor them to do what you want. I have a question from Mark on magnetically activated switches, the featherweight switches, and I've used them, and I think they're pretty handy when they work. One of the things I notice about them is, and I can't say I have a statistical sampling of the data, but maybe as a result of some hard landings, maybe that could be the problem. I kind of find they tend to become less reliable over time, and I just can't really tolerate having them something that is in a rocket, armed and ready to go, and I can't turn it off, or likewise. So I've kind of stopped using them, but I can certainly see a place for them, and not a problem with people who use them. I just don't use them anymore myself. A question on strategies and approach to altimeter ejection charge redundancy. And almost everything I do is just redundant dual deploy. I seldom do other than that. So I'll have basically the full setup to, multiple altimeters, multiple E-matches, multiple charges of black powder. I have a couple smaller rockets that might just have one altimeter in them, or an altimeter and a backup charge. But for the most part, I use redundant charges everywhere. One place I don't use redundant electronics is in lighting sustainers. I see a lot of people talk about using multiple E-matches into a sustainer to try to improve the chances of the sustainer firing. And I recommend people don't do that. I think the focus should be on trying to do one E-match and one igniter, and to do that safely with the interlocks. It's hard enough to do it with one without trying to make that part of the system redundant. And my experience is most of the time, if you can get one igniter to go, it'll light the motor, and it's not worth the complexity of a second igniter to try to do it twice for sustainers. I have a lot of photo sequences for my rockets, and in the 2018 NARCON presentation that I gave, one of the things that I talked about was video on rockets, and I didn't mention it this time, but man, you just can't put enough video cameras on rockets. I've learned so much from the videos that I've taken that shows what happened. I had one two-stage flight in particular where the booster and the sustainer actually collided twice, and I never would have figured out what happened on that flight without that video evidence. And I could point to probably easily a dozen things where it's just like I would never have figured out what happened or learned what I did without having that video evidence. So I'm a big proponent of doing that, and I have plenty of flights where I've just glued the camera to a fin or something like that, and it's more than paid off. Question on the Wi-Fi switches that I use. I just use the egg timer ones. I'm actually able to assemble those things, and they work. I don't have a lot of experience with surface mounted soldering, but I've kind of figured out how to do it on those. I guess they're not the most difficult things to put together, so I'm able to do it, and they're pretty reliable. Even with me doing it, I can make them work. I have a question on airframe construction techniques post the articles that I wrote a few years ago, and asking if I've changed anything since I wrote the articles. And the answer is definitely yes. There's a lot of things that I've done that are different now, largely because I just don't have the time at the moment for some of the processes involved. So I have a little bit simpler way of making rockets shine that doesn't involve quite as much sanding and effort, and I get probably 80% of the results, so I do that. The other thing when I put together this video, I noted was that back then I used the Cotronics epoxy for the fillets, and I also had one aspect where I put some peel ply on that fillet as part of the construction. And I no longer recommend using the Cotronics for the fillets. I don't think it's actually a very good epoxy for a lot of things, but I use it for leading edges. And I also would not recommend using peel ply if you're going to bond something to it, just because of how it fractures the epoxy. So those are probably the two main things that I would say differently, but maybe someday I'll rewrite it to come up with maybe a little bit simpler process than what I wrote there. But I do think those articles still provide some perspective, so I'm not going to take them down or anything. but there are things I do differently. Okay, Bob is asking, how did I get that picture? And that was actually a picture from the video that I mentioned where I have the two rockets were colliding. And it was pretty interesting because the electronics detected burnout prematurely, and that popped off the sustainer, which collided with the booster, and then the booster flew past the sustainer, and that's where the picture came from. And then ultimately the sustainer lit and flew back past the booster. So it's a pretty interesting video. You can find it on my, I don't know if I have a YouTube channel, but I got a lot of YouTube videos posted, and you can search for Jim in Aus 50, Jim in Austin, Jim in Aus 50, and you can find all those videos, and that particular video is posted. How do you know the pilot chute will pull the deployment bag off the rubber bands? You have to test fit the size of the deployment bag. Well, one thing I've learned about deployment bags is that if you have a reasonable and not a tiny pilot chute, and the rocket is falling down below that, there's so much force produced by that pilot chute that there's almost no way it can't pull the chute out of the bag. Drive down the road and put out a 30-inch parachute at 60 miles an hour, and you'll see that it's sort of an irresistible force, I guess. So I've not had a situation where a deployment bag wouldn't open as a result of those rubber bands. I'm just trying to keep everything together until such time as it does pull that force. What descent rate do you use for the two drogues? How did you go about figuring out drogue sizing? That's a very good question. My experience is that most people use drogue chutes that are too large, and the result is that the parts tend to hang down, and so when the main comes out, things just sort of ball together. So I recommend two things to people with regard to drogue chutes. The first is just to start small, and smaller than you might think. You can't use a descent rate calculator to determine what the drogue size should be, because what you're looking for is the rocket to fly in a V, and it's not going to fall at the rate that the descent rate calculators tell you that it's going to fall. So it's not very useful to go ahead and do that. So I just recommend to start small on a drogue chute. And then the second thing that's most important is to watch how the rocket falls. A lot of times the rocket will be coming down and people will go off and start walking towards the rocket or chatting or whatever. It's like, no. At that point, watch the rocket. How's it flying? Is the fin can above the drogue, below the drogue? Do you got a V shape? How's it look? And then based on that, you can tailor the size of the drogue chute for the next flight. Any more details on the zipperless system? That really, I don't have anything more to say than what was in the video. I just would recommend using them. I think one of the things maybe I didn't really mention that I could have is if you use a zipperless coupler, you don't have to use a motor retainer. I don't use any motor. I have one motor retainer that I installed about 15 years ago, but other than that, I don't own any. I use forward retention for basically all the motors, whether it's the through the screw fittings, or I think you can buy a little fitting to go in the charge wells on the CTI motors anyway, and so I use those. But I don't have any motor retainers, and that's just how I design rockets. On the switches, the screw switches that I showed, those are from Airframe. Questions are accumulating here. question from Conway on resources where people can learn about how to build and what methods work well and how to be more successful. I mean, there's a lot of resources for rockets. Most of, I've documented most everything that I've done in one way or another. I've got a couple threads on the Rocketry forum that probably have, most of those things. And so I would just recommend going there if you want to see stuff that I've done. Otherwise, there's a lot of stuff out there. Share experiences of going really fast, like Mach 3 to 4, stability requirements, heat, what else? I will confess that a lot of things that I do in rocketry are specifically designed not to go fast. I try to do things, long burn motors and so forth, and try to minimize the speed if I can. I tried using an ablative at one point in time. That was a disaster, so I still have to figure out how to do that. I also had a rocket that was pretty overstable and had some toning going on, and I'm hoping to refly that thing and maybe do some testing to try to see if I can solve that problem. Thank you, James. Single tube avionics bay, how do you radially align the bay inside the airframe so that you can insert the pins? When you actually insert the bay, it has the harnesses attached to it. And so you can sort of just wiggle that thing up and down until eventually it gets aligned. So, you got some black powder in there, so you got to be careful when you do that, but that's basically all that I do. It's not what I would call a real tight fit generally. The other thing you have to do with that design is also key the altimeter sled so that it orients with the holes in the airframe. And I probably got about 10 different ways that I do that. It just depends upon the design. But with a little ingenuity, it's pretty easy to figure out how to key everything so that you can do that. I didn't really show it in the presentation, but I also key my airframes on the couplers so that you can, when the airframe goes on, the shear pin holes line up without any manipulation. And I think that's another technique that I didn't share, but I pretty much do that on all my rockets too. Do I use the same brand of altimeter for redundancy? I would say probably not. Just not so much because I'm worried about using the same brand. It just sort of turns out that way. If I'm doing staging, I'm using a particular kind of altimeter, and it may be different from what I'm using for just dual deploy. So I tend to use different kinds. I would say that with modern altimeters and the reliability of them, I guess I would be less concerned about doing that now than maybe 10 years ago. If I'm using a couple perfect flight altimeters, I'm not worried at all about using the same kind of altimeter in that case. So I think maybe it's less important than it used to be. Not a bad idea. Yes, video is very good. Do I prefer three or four fin applications for altitude? I guess I probably would say right at the moment that if I was designing some high altitude, high speed rocket, I would more than likely go with the 4-fin approach, just to keep everything symmetrical, and I think there's some aerodynamic advantages to it. I've got a lot of rockets that are 3 fins and they work. But if I was doing it right now at this moment, I would probably go with 4. Thanks for watching the presentation. It looks like I'm going a little bit over time and the questions have subsided. So for those still here, thanks for all the questions you've asked and thanks for watching the video. And I'm sure that it'll be posted somewhere if you need to go back and review it. So thanks a lot.